Williamsburg Poetry Festival at Tompkins Square Park is proud to present the poets of rock and roll. Please welcome Tuli Kupferberg and Ed Sanders.
Well, welcome. It was
many years ago.
in the summer.
Dark and stormy night.
We began on Avenue B in 1962 when around April there was an avant-garde movie theater called the Charles Theater on the east side of Avenue B at about between 11th and 12th, just before you got to the famous Stanley's Bar. And a beat hero used to hang outside the Charles Theater after the avant-garde films. There would be Jonas Mekas, Guns of the Trees by the Mekas Brothers, or Ron Rice, The Flower Thief, or movies that Taylor Mead was in. And a guy named Kupferberg was hanging outside selling his avant-garde publications called Birth, and what was the other one? Yeah?
Yeah.
You gotta get into the mic.
It was, yeah.
And
Wing.
I was living on Avenue A at the time in a back building, and I decided to start a magazine and collected some poems from Tuli. And the magazine was called Fuck You, a magazine of the arts, which is keeping me from running for office where I live now. I have to explain to press conferences that it was the title was a marketing strategy to grab attention for a far-out endeavor. But anyway, so I published Tuli's poems, and I had known him because he was in all the beat anthologies, groovy pictures of him with his mate Sylvia in the book called The Beats, or he was published, and it was like to me a beat hero because I was a trembling young man from the Midwest, and finally at New York University, finally had enough nerve to meet Tuli and began publishing his poems, and then graduated from college in '64 and became pretty good friends with Tuli, and we would go to the poetry meetings at the Le Metro Cafe and other rebel cafes in the Lower East Side where we read our poems. The milieu, poetry hadn't been read aloud in public since maybe the 30s or 20s, Vachon Lindsay and that generation. And then the poetry had died out till in the 50s and 60s when the oral tradition caught hold again. And there were readings in numerous coffee shops in the East and West Village. So I graduated from college in '64. I was enrolled in graduate school. I was going to study Indo-European linguistics. And I decided in order to pay for my expenses, I would start a bookstore called the P-Side Bookstore, and I found an old kosher meat market. It turns out it was right next to Lifshutz Wholesale Egg Store on between Avenue B and Avenue C. I had no idea that on the second floor above Lifshutz Wholesale Egg Store and next to the meat market that was about to become the P-Side Bookstore lived Tuli Kupferberg, beat hero. So I kept the word strictly kosher on the outside of and I just put a plaque, P-Side Bookstore, and opened up. This was the fall. And then late in the year, this was the year '64, the year of Mustang Sally, I think. Well, it was the year of Roy Orbison's I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Shangri-La's leader of the pack, and more importantly, the arrival of the Beatles, and the idea of words counting in music. So Tuli and I talked it over that fall and decided to form a band. I'll briefly give the milieu, and then Tuli and I are going to talk about our musical roots. The place was the Lower East Side, a place that had been slums basically since the overcrowding after the War of 1812, when they built back buildings and crowded tenements on the spots of old Dutch kitchen gardens, and that the area called the Lower East Side became a home to numerous different flows of immigrants for a century, a couple hundred years almost. And then by the 30s, there came in New York City a huge citywide movement to have rent control. Rent control just didn't appear as a gift from the gods. It was a result of a citywide tenants council that was formed in 1936 and during the Depression, and labored vigorously and successfully into getting a rent control law, which was transformed during Roosevelt's era during World War II into a full-fledged rent control.
Yeah, because there was no housing construction at all during that time. They were too busy building instruments of pacification or death, whatever you want to call.
So that when I came from Missouri in 1958, and Tuli moved to the Lower East Side, when in 59, 60? Anyway, when we arrived there, the World War II rent controls were still in place, so that the rat race was less rat-like, in that you could get a pad or turn down a pad because it was overpriced at $25 a month or $18 a month or $31 a month. So that was in,
50 was what I paid.
you got ripped off, Kupferberg. What can I tell you?
No, what happened was I was being charged 15, I think.
Oh, 15. You
Yeah,
said 50.
and no, 15.
All right,
It was a
15.
steam heated apartment on Broome Street, all the way east. And the landlord was a lawyer, a speculator. And I worked at the nonprofit messenger service, which was well named, non-paying also. And 1 month I could only pay $14. And the landlord came back 3 times with his big Buick, you know, with those fins, remember that? To collect $1. So I asked him once, I said, do you think you have a God-given, I didn't have the dollar, God-given right to collect rent? And that sort of stopped me from rent. So after that, I got really pissed off, and I went to rent control. And the real rent was $11.50. So I got a lot of back rent into that free rent.
Well, Tuli, to backtrack a little bit, I've learned since, I think I knew Tuli about 40 years before I learned that he was the principal organizer of an anarchist delivery service. Where was that, on Broome Street?
No, it was on 25th Street in the garment district. And our clients were mostly advertisers and garment people. I was one of the organizers.
Sometimes it takes a few decades to learn about the anarchist delivery service origins of Friends. Anyway, so we came to the Lower East Side, a place where you could get a cheap pad, and a place where, in spite of some transgressions, the police tended to leave you alone, and you could look strange and not get rousted and not get bothered, really. I never was bothered by the police except for one raid on my bookstore to confiscate my magazine. Other than that, that was it. Anyway, it was a place, an era in the United States when there was no reason not to feel hope. The Kennedys, President Kennedy was still alive. There were the freedom rides of 1961. There were numerous successful endeavors to create voting rights in the United States. There was music. Everybody seemed to have a guitar. A lot of people sang together.
Bush was a little boy yet.
No one had a telephone, and when Kennedy was assassinated, we had to go into Stanley's bar on 12th and Avenue B to look at the coverage, or when Kennedy delivered his October speech declaring the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and we thought the world was going to come to an end. We learned about it and were able to mug our livers with vodka at Stanley's bar on 12th and A, across from the Charles Theater. Anyway, there was a climate of salvation of the city. It looked as if the city could be saved as a viable place to live and to share and to grow, and there was a tremendous explosion of creativity after World War II, brought about by the GI Bill and by the energy of those who triumphed in World War II and went through the Red Scares of the 50s and the Eisenhower era, and we're in the early 60s when it still seemed like there was going to be a rising tide of successful transformation of the culture. And then there was rock and roll. There was folk music, and there were places to play. So Tuli and I decided to start a bifurcated path, one leg toward revolution, the other leg toward fun and thrills. And we were naive enough to believe that the fun and thrill path and the revolution path were close enough to hold hands or hold glands. Anyway, and there had been then the happening movement. You could rent a gallery and get a stock tank full of Jell-O, and you get a couple of people to stand naked and they get a smoke gun, and somebody read Petrarch's sonnets, and you charge $2.50 to get in. It seemed like it was possible to earn one's living through art and through writing. And Tuli and I formed this band. And
it's possible.
We immediately wrote 40 or 50 songs, and we immediately started having concerts. The junkies broke into my bookstore and stole all the instruments, stole our drums, stole everything we had gathered for the band.
Did they steal your collection of pubic hair to the poets?
No. But they
were in glassine envelopes. Maybe they could become confused. No, what happened with those? They're now in the Museum of Modern Art.
No, I gave a bunch of them away. But anyway, we formed this band and started writing songs. So I thought there might be some interest. I think there's songwriters in the room. So I think there'd be some interest in learning some techniques that Tuli and I have evolved over the years in creating these songs we've written. For instance, first thing to note is a career is 60 or 70 years, and to develop systems, if you're a songwriter, of creating ideas and keeping files and creating melodies and tunes during that 60 or 70 years, so that it is during anything you might write and now could 40 or 50 years from now be of use to you. So Tuli, what were your first, in a serious way, what was your musical background? Did you go to vaudeville or Yiddish theater?
I began my stage career very early. I was less than 6, I think. I might have been 5 or 4. And it was a depression, and there was a movie theater. I lived on 5th Avenue, Brooklyn, which had we lived on the wrong side of the tracks, you know, not where the brownstones were. But my father had a store. He failed 3 times during the Depression. I think that was not a record, but it was an accomplishment. Anyway, there was a movie theater there called the Senate, I think. And they had an amateur night, and before I knew it, my mother had me on stage. And what I did was I had velvet black shorts, I remember that. And I didn't know what I was supposed to do, so I jiggled my feet once or twice. And I won the amateur night prize. I remember it was a silver ball of maybe $5. And all the adult participants must have hated my guts. That's how I began my stage career. But there was
When did you start writing songs?
Oh, the next day. No, when did I start writing songs? Well, there was a lot of music in my family, although there were no trained musicians.
Like what?
We had a Victrola, which was like a hand-wound record player. There were people would buy these vinyl double-sided single records. I remember hearing those. And my father belonged to a Landsmannschaft, a society, a benevolent society of people from the same city in Poland. Sanok, you all remember that town, and it was such a, yeah, Sanok. It was such a, you know, when there were 2 Jews together, 2 Jewish organizations, there's always a third. So my father belonged to the younger group called the Progressive Sonica Young Men's Society, and they were young, and there were weddings, a lot of weddings. Young people get married sometimes. And I used to go to the weddings. I must have been 7 years old, and there were klezmer bands there, and I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated by the bands, and I used to stand in front of the band and listen to the music. So that's my earliest musical influence, and I haven't gotten over it yet. And then I remember going to public school, and public school 82 in Manhattan. And there was a settlement house nearby where we all went swimming every week. So the school entered the city swimming contest and came in second. And I was appointed to write a poem about that. And it went, I remember one line. They fought that they swam for you, and they brought that cup to 82. And that was so well received. It still gets applause. And I got so much praise for that I was trapped forever in the pursuit of feudal fame. And I would listen to the after-school disc jockeys, I forget their name, and 3 other people and myself became interested in jazz. And at Brooklyn College, there was a jazz society. I remember that. We'd come to the village and listen to Boogie Woogie. That was Albert Ammons and different Boogie Woogie piano players. And it was folk music at Brooklyn College because it was a nest of commie rats. Erwin Silva was one of the people there, and there were separate tables for the commies and the Trotskyites and the anarchists. And Silva was like a deadly opponent of Trotskyism, probably still is. And I was writing poetry then, and when I left school, and I was also a rabid revolutionary, so I never prepared for a profession, because I remember my father told me that when he grew up on the East Side before World War I, married couples would not buy furniture because they knew that the revolution was coming and the government would confiscate it. So that was a lesson I learned. I don't think I've bought furniture since then. And I'm still waiting. Well, you could buy second-hand furniture. As a matter of fact, I have a second-hand Victrola that I bought at the Salvation Army, but the Salvation Army sold out. You used to be able to buy books there, but now they have people who come, merchants come and buy the whole thing out. But that's America for you.
So
what was the question?
well, what was the first, talk about these singers and folk music strands and performers that you became.
Oh yeah, well, actually, we had radio. My parents were practically literate, and there were Yiddish programs every Sunday. I could sing you some of the songs. And
Yes.
you know, let's see. Joe and Paul, a star of Wagen, Joe and Paul McKenna bargain, kriegen a kite, a soup, a ball, no, a suit, a gabardine, bring rein, your kleinen zing, that's a clothing store, bring your son in. And then there was, Marsh shucks, malted milk, it's good for kleine Kinder. Planters, peanut oil, it's good for baking cake. So those were some of my earliest influences. And then the comic folk songs were, they were very, these were all middle class, young Jewish girls and boys, or men and women as we called them later. And they sang all the traditional songs until you, I liked all the songs. And I did go to Bed-Stuy once, and I heard Charlie Christian play his electric guitar. He carried a battery, he had a suitcase and there was a battery in it. So that's the earliest, those are my earliest influences. Jazz, Jewish music, and folk music. And then look what became.
And Yiddish commercials.
What, and Yiddish commercials, yeah, they were good.
So,
And what were your earliest influences?
Tuli and I collided and came together and became friends at my bookstore, really, the P-Side bookstore, which was the first community center in the Lower East Side that provided, something approaching a bulletin board. We always had a mimeograph machine on hand to publish anything that anybody wanted to print. And before I go into the music, I brought from my home, and I still have my P-Side bookstore mimeograph machine in my studio, because I can have a leaflet out if the electricity goes and they try to set up Camp Condi. And I brought with me, for you people who are in the Kinko generation, some tools of the so-called mimeograph revolution. I printed my Fuck You, a magazine of the arts, but also numerous street leaflets, and we had the committee to legalize marijuana at the P-Side bookstore. And always in the back room of the P-Side bookstore was a mimeograph machine. And these are stencils, and you could hand draw on these with a light board or with these styli, and you would draw on them. You had to be very careful not to cut the stencil, so it was a very, very disciplined thing. I used to draw many of the drawings for my magazines, and I would have to do it very meticulously on these stencils. Or you would, and if you wanted to type, you would put them into a typewriter, and when there was an error, you had stencil correction fluid, and you abraded the error with a paper clip very slightly, and then you pasted on this correction fluid. This is 1966. I put it up on eBay. This is for Fuck You, a magazine of the arts, the final issue. I don't know, what do you think? eBay. Okay, so that was the mimeograph revolution. I was part of it. That was the source of my only trouble in the Lower East Side, where I lived for 10 years, as the police raided my bookstore after a Fugs concert in early 1966 and carted away a lot of those issues, costing me plenty. If I had, if I could eBay all that stuff that they took out of my bookstore, we're talking 50. I know a full run of my magazine is like $5,000 or something. And Captain Fink, he owes me big. I think he's in retirement if he's still alive, because they used to keep a box of my magazine in this precinct house over there to show visiting dignitaries the ruinous and despicable smut to be secured from the Lower East Side. Even though I printed, Charles Olson and W.H. Auden and
he was the
Ezra
worst.
Pound and Robert Duncan and Allen Ginsberg, some of Diane Wachowski, Diane DePrima, Lenore Condell, and some of the best minds of my particular generation. Anyway, so I was part of that, and so we decided to form a group. I am from the Midwest. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri. I took the obligatory 5 years of piano lessons. My mother purchased a piano, a baby grand for us to play on, and I took 5 years of those. And I studied drums with the drummer for the Kansas City Philharmonic. And we used to have these mixers in high school with great jazz players. We did not know that they were great jazz players from Kansas City. Thus, Jay McShann, our famous, would come play. We would do mixers and dance. Or Big Bob Doherty would come play. The great jazz bands would play for high schools, but also there were high school dance clubs in Kansas City where a guy like me could go dance with black girls, which was the ultimate thrill for us because we were from outside Kansas City, and also dance with ladies, young women from other countries such as South, like Mexico. So it was like a it was a multicultural experience, and the